At 9:40 in the morning Washington time on August the 17th, a deadline that had been building for 2 months quietly expired. No missiles fired, no statement of victory, no statement of defeat either, just silence, followed by a phone call to a television network. And inside that call, a claim that would be denied within hours by the very people it was about. This is the story of how a president who has drawn more red lines in the sand than perhaps any American leader in modern memory watched another one dissolve, and how the machinery of Washington, for the second time this year, seemed to hesitate at the very moment it had promised to strike. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to February. On February the 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran. According to Britannica and multiple wire reports, nearly 900 strikes hit Iranian targets in the span of 12 hours. The first wave killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of senior military and political officials. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential nights in the modern history of the Middle East. Iran's Ministry of Intelligence lost senior officials, command centers were flattened, and within hours, Tehran responded, launching missiles and drones not just at Israel, but at American bases across the Gulf and at commercial shipping lanes that the entire global economy depends on. It helps to understand that this war did not erupt out of nowhere. Tensions between Washington and Tehran trace back, in the broadest sense, to the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the hostage crisis that followed, which set a tone of mutual suspicion that has never fully lifted in the decades since. More immediately, the roots of the February strikes lie in the collapse of the 2015 nuclear agreement, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which Trump withdrew the United States from during his first term. According to Britannica's account of the lead-up to the war, the immediate triggers were Iran's continued nuclear enrichment, its ballistic missile program, its reach across the region through allied militias, and repeated failed attempts to negotiate a replacement for that abandoned 2015 deal. In February 2026 alone, the United States and Iran held 3 separate rounds of indirect talks over the nuclear and missile programs, even as Washington was simultaneously moving additional military assets into the region, talks and military buildup happening in parallel, right up until February the 26th, only 2 days before the strikes began. The human cost of the opening days alone was severe. Britannica's ongoing account of the war notes that the initial wave of strikes killed roughly 170 people when a missile hit a girls' school located next to a naval base near Bandar Abbas. Human rights monitoring groups tracking casualties inside Iran, cited by NBC News, estimated that by June, strikes had left at least 657 people killed and well over 2,000 wounded, with Iran's own health ministry putting the wounded figure above 2,500. Iran's retaliation carried its own toll beyond its borders. Strikes on the United Arab Emirates killed 3 foreign workers from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, according to Wikipedia's sourced casualty tracking, while a missile strike on the Israeli town of Beit Shemesh in early March killed 9 civilians, among the deadliest single strikes Iran carried out during the conflict's opening phase. The war that followed did not stay contained. Iran struck targets in the United Arab Emirates, killing several foreign workers. It struck Jordan. It began targeting vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, through which, before the war, roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil and gas passed every single day. According to the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man killed on the war's first night, inherited a country under bombardment and a population already exhausted by economic collapse and mass protests that had begun months earlier. Washington, meanwhile, was set on a specific set of goals: dismantling Iran's nuclear program, degrading its ballistic missile capability, and cutting off support to its regional partners. It's also worth noting that even before the guns went quiet, Iran's domestic situation was already fragile. According to Britannica's timeline, an economic spiral inside the country had already led to mass street protests beginning on December the 28th, 2025, 2 full months before the war even started, meaning the government in Tehran entered this conflict already managing internal unrest on top of everything the war itself would bring. That context matters when weighing Iran's later claims that its government was, in Trump's own words from April, seriously fractured. By April, a first ceasefire had been reached, brokered by Pakistan. It did not hold cleanly. On April the 7th, President Trump gave one of the most extraordinary ultimatums of his presidency, warning that if Iran did not immediately and fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, in his words, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. According to Al Jazeera's own review of Trump's deadlines, Tehran did not blink, and with 2 hours left on the clock, it was Trump who adjusted course, announcing instead a 2-week ceasefire brokered once again by Islamabad. 2 weeks later, on April the 21st, that ceasefire itself was extended, this time at what the White House described as the request of Pakistan's Field Marshal Asim Munir and Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, citing what Trump called Iran's seriously fractured government. The pattern, even by spring, was becoming visible: hard deadlines, dramatic language, and then, at the final hour, a step back. That pattern is central to understanding what happened this past Monday, because the deadline that expired on August the 17th was not some minor technical marker. It was the centerpiece of the most serious diplomatic effort of the entire war, the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. The memorandum was finalized after weeks of shuttle diplomacy. According to Wikipedia's detailed account of the negotiations, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif announced on June the 12th that the United States and Iran had agreed on a final text to end the war. 3 days later, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance confirmed that both sides had digitally signed the memorandum. Then, on June the 17th, in a moment almost cinematic in its staging, President Trump signed the agreement remotely, from Versailles, during a dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron following the G7 summit, while Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed his copy in Tehran. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, issued a written statement saying he endorsed the memorandum, despite what he described as his own misgivings. The text of that memorandum, later released publicly and preserved on Wikisource and by the American Presidency Project, laid out 14 points. It called for the immediate and permanent halt of military operations on every front, including in Lebanon. It committed the United States to beginning the removal of its naval blockade around Iran immediately, with full removal within 30 days. It committed Iran to making its best efforts to ensure the safe, toll-free passage of commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz for 60 days. And in one of its more remarkable provisions, it committed Washington, together with regional partners, to developing a reconstruction and economic development plan for Iran worth at least $300 billion, a plan whose implementation mechanism was itself supposed to be finalized within that same 60-day window. Crucially, point 3 of the memorandum stated plainly that the United States and Iran would negotiate and achieve a final deal within a maximum of 60 days, extendable only by mutual consent. That 60-day clock is the deadline this entire story is about. It did not survive its first month intact. On July the 8th, according to Wikipedia's chronicle of the memorandum's collapse, Iran struck multiple commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz, asserting what it called its sovereign right to control passage through the waterway. The United States responded by striking Iranian territory again. President Trump, reacting to the flare-up, indicated publicly that the memorandum was, in his word, over, though he added that negotiators could continue talking while voicing pessimism about where things stood. Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, posted that the American boarding of an Iranian oil tanker constituted, in his words, an act of war, adding that striking a commercial vessel and taking its crew hostage is an even greater violation. From that point through August, the war simmered rather than paused. Strikes and counterstrikes over shipping, disputes over who actually controlled the strait, and a diplomatic track that never fully died, but never fully recovered either. There were moments that suggested a breakthrough might still be possible. Axios reported on August the 5th that the U.S. and Iran were nearing a narrower deal specifically focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz. According to that reporting, there had been several calls in the preceding days between U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi, with regional sources saying Araghchi had agreed in principle over the weekend, pending final approval from Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei and Iran's Supreme National Security Council. For a few days, it looked like Washington and Tehran might actually land a piece of the larger puzzle before the 60-day clock ran out. That approval never came through in any confirmed public way. And so the deadline arrived, Monday, August the 17th, with the framework's central promise, a comprehensive final deal, unmet. Here is where the story earns its title. According to CNN's live coverage from that day, as the deadline passed with no announced extension and no concrete plan to end the war, President Trump did not order new strikes, did not declare an ultimatum with a fresh countdown. Instead, in a telephone interview with Fox News chief foreign correspondent Trey Yingst, he said he was, in his own words, not in a hurry, and that he had no time schedule. He described Iranian officials as good poker players, but insisted the country itself was dying. He said Tehran should raise what he called the white flag of surrender. And in the same conversation, according to CNN, the Jerusalem Post, and Middle East Monitor, Trump made a striking claim that his administration had established a direct backchannel with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, an organization the United States formally designates as a foreign terrorist organization, and one that, under the administration's own long-declared policy, Washington does not deal with directly. The reaction from Tehran was immediate, and it was a flat denial. IRGC spokesman Brigadier General Hossein Mohebi told Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency that there was, in his words, no dialogue taking place between IRGC officials and the Americans. And he went further, calling Trump's claim merely fantasies caused by the delusions and nightmares resulting from defeat and desperation in the war. Mohebi added that diplomacy simply was not within the IRGC's remit, and that based on statements from Iran's foreign ministry, there were no talks happening with the Americans even at the political level, given what he called Washington's record of broken promises. Multiple outlets, CBS News, Al Jazeera, and Tasnim's own English service, carried nearly identical versions of that denial within hours of Trump's comments airing. As of this recording, the contradiction between the two sides has not been resolved, and neither the White House nor any named U.S. official has produced independent confirmation that the claimed backchannel exists. It's worth pausing here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a viewer deserves honesty rather than a smoothed-over narrative. We do not know, with confidence, whether Trump's backchannel claim is true. We know he made the claim on the record to a named journalist, and we know Iran's IRGC denied it on the record, through a named spokesman on the same day. Both of those facts are real. What sits between them is not. While that dispute was unfolding, Trump made a second announcement that arguably rattled the region even more, because it wasn't aimed at Iran at all. It was aimed at an American partner. Trump threatened to bomb Oman. According to reporting from HNGN and corroborated by the Jerusalem Post, Trump's anger was directed at Oman's parallel diplomatic efforts with Tehran, specifically over control of the Strait of Hormuz, efforts that Washington viewed as potentially undercutting the American negotiating position. The phrasing, confirmed across multiple outlets, was blunt, even by Trump's standards. He said the United States would, quote, bomb the Sonanimd out of them if Oman interfered. To understand why that threat landed so hard in diplomatic circles, you need to understand what Oman actually is to this conflict. For more than a decade, Oman has served as the primary backchannel between Washington and Tehran. It hosted nuclear talks during the Obama administration. It facilitated prisoner exchanges during the Biden years. And according to reporting reviewed for this story, it was the venue for the most sensitive pre-war diplomatic contacts between American and Iranian officials in the opening months of 2026, before the February strikes. Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Busaidi, had been named directly in the Axios, reporting about the near-miss Hormuz deal just 12 days earlier. In other words, the country Trump threatened to bomb is the same country whose foreign minister had, according to regional sources, been quietly working toward exactly the kind of breakthrough Washington claimed to want. That contradiction has not gone unnoticed by analysts covering the region, who point to a broader pattern in this conflict in which the administration's public statements about the state of diplomacy have repeatedly diverged from what wire services and diplomatic sources have reported from inside the actual negotiations. Iran, for its part, did not treat the deadline's expiration as a moment to soften its language either. According to the Jerusalem Post, a senior Iranian official told Reuters that Tehran would escalate tensions in the Strait of Hormuz and across the wider region if diplomacy with the United States continued to fail, language that outlets covering the story characterized as signaling an Iranian policy shift, moving from a defensive posture toward what one report called a fully offensive one. Separately, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghei used his weekly press briefing, as reported by Shafakna and citing Tasnim, to reject the entire premise of a 60-day deadline as it was being discussed in Washington and in Western media. Baghei said there was no provision in the memorandum referring to a 60-day deadline in the ultimatum sense, and stated that, in his words, the Islamic Republic of Iran never formulates its policies under pressure, ultimatums, or time limits. He argued the memorandum instead provided a 60-day negotiating period specifically on sanctions relief and the nuclear program, one that, under the text's own terms, could be extended by mutual consent if the two sides simply failed to finish in time. Iran's position, in other words, is that there was never really a hard cliff edge to begin with, only a target that both sides could have agreed to move. That framing matters because it changes how you read Trump's own posture. If Iran is right that the memorandum always allowed for a mutual extension, then Trump declaring he's not in a hurry isn't necessarily him backing down from a hard deadline. It may be him quietly accepting the extension Tehran always said was built into the deal, just without using that word. If Trump's camp is right that Iran was simply stalling and hoping Washington would blink, then his own comments to Fox News, no time schedule, not in a hurry, read very differently. They read as exactly the blink Tehran was waiting for. Foreign Minister Araghchi had already previewed this argument days earlier. According to reporting from globalsecurity.org citing Iran's IRNA news agency, Araghchi told reporters on August the 9th that negotiations between Iran and the United States were not currently taking place at all, and that talks could not resume until Washington ended what he called its violation of commitments and compensated for those breaches. He acknowledged that messages were still being exchanged through intermediaries, but insisted that exchange should not be dignified with the word negotiations. This is also where the story connects back to a broader pattern that PBS News laid out in careful detail just one day before the deadline expired. PBS's own count found at least 3 separate occasions where Trump set a hard deadline for Iran and then delayed it. There was the February 19th ultimatum, 10 to 15 days for a meaningful nuclear agreement delivered at the first meeting of Trump's newly created Board of Peace in Washington, warning that otherwise bad things happen. There was the March 21st 48-hour ultimatum over the Strait of Hormuz, threatening to, in Trump's words, hit and obliterate their various power plants, a deadline that shifted from Monday to Tuesday and then dissolved into the April ceasefire. And there was the whole civilization will die tonight threat on April the 7th, walked back with 2 hours to spare. PBS's analysis, published as this latest deadline approached, noted plainly that both Washington and Tehran appeared to be betting the other side would blink first, and that as of their reporting, neither had. What happened on August the 17th, according to the events documented here, looks very much like an answer to that open question, at least for now, and at least on the American side of the ledger, since it was Washington, not Tehran, that let the deadline pass without triggering the consequences it had spent 2 months implying would follow. On the military side, the memorandum's terms carried real teeth, at least on paper. Beyond the naval blockade removal and the 60-day shipping arrangement, the agreement also committed the United States to removing its forces from the immediate proximity of Iran within 30 days of any final deal being reached. A clause that, as of this recording, has never been triggered because no final deal exists. During the active fighting itself, the U.S. Sixth Fleet stationed a group of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean specifically to assist Israeli missile defense and disrupt Iranian strikes, according to Wikipedia's detailed order of battle tracking of the conflict, underscoring just how large a military footprint the United States committed to this war before diplomacy ever got a real chance to work. There's a reason the stakes around the Strait of Hormuz specifically keep pulling this story back to the same flashpoint. Before the war, roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil and gas moved through that waterway. The Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker notes that Iran's Basij paramilitary chief has publicly stated that the strait is, in his words, under Iran's control and management. A claim made just one day after Trump himself posted on social media asserting American control over the same waterway. Two governments, two flatly contradictory public claims about who controls one of the most economically important channels of water on Earth, and a shipping lane that, since February, has seen commercial vessels struck, rerouted, and in some cases abandoned entirely as insurers and shipping companies weigh the risk. That is the immediate, tangible reason why an American president threatening to bomb Oman, and why Iran threatening to escalate in the strait, are not abstract diplomatic gestures. They are threats aimed directly at the artery through which a meaningful share of the global economy still needs to breathe. It's worth spending a moment on the diplomatic machinery itself, because the same names keep reappearing throughout this entire timeline, and their track record helps explain both the progress that has been made and the trust that has been lost. Vice President J.D. Vance led the U.S. negotiating team during the Islamabad talks in April, arriving alongside Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff Asim Munir and Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar. According to photographs and reporting from the media line, Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, and Jared Kushner have together handled nearly every direct or indirect contact with Iranian officials since talks first began in early 2026. From the Geneva session days before the war, to a June meeting in Doha with regional mediators, to the April trip to Islamabad, where Axios reported that Iranian state media initially denied any meeting had even been scheduled, only for the two sides to meet anyway. That April episode is a useful reminder that public denials from Tehran, of the kind issued this week by the IRGC, are not new to this conflict. They have happened before, sometimes shortly before contact was confirmed to have taken place regardless. That history doesn't prove Trump's backchannel claim is true. But it is a reason not to treat Iran's denial this week as automatically the final word either. There's also a domestic political layer to this that deserves honest treatment rather than speculation dressed up as fact. According to the Jerusalem Post's account of the same Fox News interview, Trump was asked directly whether the upcoming American midterm elections were shaping his strategy on Iran. His answer, on the record, was blunt. Midterms have nothing to do with my thinking. PBS News, in its own reporting on the deadline, offered additional context without attributing motive to Trump personally, noting that escalating the war further would likely draw down American supplies of advanced missile interceptors, jolt an already nervous global economy, and drive up gas prices in the run-up to those same congressional elections, dynamics that exist regardless of what Trump himself says is or isn't influencing his calculus. Both of those things, Trump's denial and the underlying economic pressure that exists independent of his denial, are worth including here, side by side, without pretending one cancels out the other. The same day the Iran deadline expired, Washington's diplomatic attention was also stretched toward an entirely separate front. According to CNN's live coverage, Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for more than 4 hours, reportedly discussing a Gaza ceasefire framework. It's a reminder that the Iran deadline did not expire in a vacuum. The same small circle of American negotiators, Kushner, Witkoff, Vance, has spent much of 2026 shuttling between multiple simultaneous crises, and the bandwidth required to manage Gaza, Lebanon, and the Iran file all at once is itself a factor that regional diplomats and analysts have pointed to when explaining why Washington's public messaging on any single front, including Iran, has sometimes appeared inconsistent or hurried. It's also worth remembering how close Washington and Tehran came to a diplomatic resolution before the war ever started, because it puts this August deadline in sharper perspective. According to analysis published by the Arms Control Association, less than 48 hours before the February 28th strikes began, U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Geneva for a third round of Omani-mediated nuclear talks. Recordings and transcripts reviewed by the association indicated that Iran had floated a proposal allowing a limited enrichment program tied specifically to fueling research reactors, paired with broad International Atomic Energy Agency oversight and without accumulating enriched uranium gas. In other words, there was an actual proposal on the table just 2 days before the war began. Whatever assessment led Washington and Jerusalem to conclude that diplomacy had been exhausted, it happened in an extraordinarily narrow window, and it's a detail that continues to inform how skeptically some analysts view the administration's more recent claims of active, productive backchannels, including the one Trump described this week. Even the earlier ceasefires document this same push and pull between military threat and diplomatic patience. Time magazine's coverage from late June recorded Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi warning that any interference or attempt to create parallel arrangements will only complicate the situation, increase tensions, and delay the reopening of this vital waterway. A warning aimed, at the time, at exactly the kind of third-party mediation that Oman is now being threatened over. That same period saw French President Emmanuel Macron meet Omani leader Haitham bin Tariq, with both sides announcing they were working together for de-escalation and coordinating on demining the strait to secure maritime routes. The infrastructure for a peaceful resolution, in other words, has existed in some form for months. What has consistently been missing is the final political decision, on either side, to use it. One more thread deserves mention because it surfaced the same week and adds a layer of complexity to the backchannel question specifically. According to reporting circulated by outlets tracking the conflict and citing an earlier Axios report, there have been claims that Nechervan Barzani, a senior Kurdish regional figure, may have served as a mediator link connected to the disputed IRGC backchannel. Separately, and reported as its own event rather than confirmed as connected, Kurdish Regional President Masroor Barzani stated that his personal office and the home of the head of the Regional Security and Intelligence Agency were targeted by Iranian drone attacks in Erbil, with no casualties reported. Whether that drone strike is meaningfully connected to backchannel diplomacy, retaliation, or a separate regional dispute entirely has not been established by any named source reviewed for this script, and it should be treated as an open, unconfirmed thread rather than a resolved fact. So where does that leave things as of this recording? The honest answer is unresolved, and deliberately so by both sides. The 60-day deadline that was supposed to produce a comprehensive final settlement, covering Iran's nuclear program, sanctions relief, the $300 billion reconstruction plan, and a permanent resolution on the Strait of Hormuz, has passed without that settlement. Washington has not announced new military action tied to the deadline's expiration, nor has it announced an extension using the memorandum's own mutual consent language. Tehran has publicly denied Trump's most notable diplomatic claim of the day, while simultaneously signaling it may shift toward a more aggressive posture in the strait if talks continue to stall. And an American ally, Oman, has been publicly threatened by the President of the United States for the crime of trying to broker exactly the kind of deal Washington says it wants. It's also worth putting a number on what restraint has actually cost so far, because that's often the part these stories skip past. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz to normal traffic, combined with Iranian attacks on Gulf Arab oil and gas sites and U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iranian oil and gas installations, drove global energy markets into turmoil for months, according to the Council on Foreign Relations tracking of the war's economic fallout. Shipping companies rerouted around both the Strait and the Red Sea, adding time and cost to global trade routes that businesses and consumers ultimately absorb. A betting market cited by Zero Hedge, tracking whether Strait of Hormuz traffic would return to normal by the end of September, showed the overwhelming majority of participants betting against a return to normalcy. a rough but telling signal of how little confidence traders and analysts currently place in a near-term resolution, regardless of what either government says publicly. If there is a single thread that ties February to August, it's this. Both sides have now spent nearly 6 months daring the other to move first, and for 6 months, neither fully has. Iran has taken devastating losses. Its supreme leader killed on the war's opening night. Its military and intelligence leadership repeatedly targeted. Its economy strained by blockade and sanctions layered on top of protests that began before the war even started. The United States, for its part, has drawn deadline after deadline. 10 to 15 days in February, 48 hours in March, a matter of hours in April, 60 days from June to August, and has, by the accounting of multiple news organizations tracking this specific pattern, allowed nearly every one of them to pass without following through on its most extreme stated consequence. That is not, on its own, proof of weakness. Diplomacy sometimes requires exactly this kind of patient walking back, and a president choosing not to escalate a nuclear-armed regional war is not inherently a failure of strategy. But it is a pattern. It is a documented one. And it is the pattern this particular deadline just became the newest entry in. Before closing, it's worth being transparent about where this account comes from and where the uncertainty genuinely lies. The background on the war's origins and its human cost is drawn from Britannica, the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, and War on the Rocks. The text and signing of the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding is drawn from Wikisource's published copy of the document, the American Presidency Project's archive, and Wikipedia's sourced account of the signing ceremony at Versailles. The events of August the 17th itself, Trump's comments to Fox News, the IRGC's denial, the threat against Oman, and Iran's response are drawn from CNN's live coverage, CBS News, the Jerusalem Post, Al Jazeera, Middle East Monitor, and Tasnim News Agency's own English-language reporting of its spokesman's statement. The pattern of prior deadlines is drawn from PBS News and Al Jazeera's own retrospective reporting. The near deal on the Strait of Hormuz in early August comes from Axios, citing regional sources. What remains genuinely unverified, and should be treated that way, is the core factual dispute at the center of this entire story. Whether an actual American backchannel to the IRGC exists at all. Trump says it does. The IRGC says it's a lie. No independent named source has confirmed either version, and this script is not going to pretend otherwise. The connection between the reported Barzani mediation claim and the drone strike on Barzani's office in Erbil is similarly unconfirmed, and should be read as two separate reported events rather than one established causal chain. What strikes many longtime observers of this conflict is not any single decision made this week, but the accumulation of them. A president who has, by multiple independent counts, set and then softened at least 4 major deadlines against the same adversary in the space of 6 months. A government in Tehran that insists it never recognized the deadline as binding in the first place, even as it signed a document that explicitly used the word maximum to describe it. And a diplomatic map so tangled that the United States now finds itself threatening to bomb one of its own most reliable regional partners for trying to solve the exact problem Washington itself hasn't solved. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a government sets a deadline, breaks its own pattern of deadlines by not enforcing this one either, and then calls that restraint rather than retreat, at what point does the distinction between the two stop mattering to the people actually living along the Strait of Hormuz, in Tehran, in the Gulf states, and across a region that has now been at war, in one form or another, for nearly 6 months? Is this patience, or is this exactly the blink both sides swore they wouldn't be the first to make? Let us know what you think this moment actually signals for what comes next. That's where things stand as of this recording. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the next update as this story develops.